Thank you. So welcome again, everybody. Welcome to Clue's Spiritual Wellspring event. I know this is a very busy time. We've got the holidays coming, the end of the year is approaching. So I really do appreciate you taking this time to be with us. In addition to it being a busy time, I know this is also has been a really rough time for Jews and Muslims in particular, but also for all faith leaders, all activists, all everyone really who's engaged in social justice work, everyone who's committed to healing and accompanying the world in the midst of trauma. As leaders, we often absorb a good deal of this trauma ourselves, so that's why we wanted to have this event. So this event is really for you. We are offering it as sustenance to your soul, sustenance to your work, sustenance to your ministry. So I'm going to be sharing from a Christian perspective this evening, followed by Akbar Hussaini from a Muslim perspective, and then Gyokei from a Buddhist perspective, and finally Yehudah from the Jewish faith tradition. And I think Jackie put this in the chat, but just as a reminder, please use the Q&A feature, which we have Matthew Hom, one of our staff, monitoring throughout the time together. So you can use that to submit any questions you have for any of the panelists, and then we'll make sure we reserve some time at the end for them to answer your questions. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And so I'm going to start, and I wanted to begin with a story. Some of you who know me well know that the last appointment I served as a pastor in a local church was at St. John's United Methodist Church, which is an African-American congregation, and it's located directly across from the Watts Towers, obviously in Watts in Southern California. And I would say they're a very faithful congregation, and I enjoyed immensely my time with them. But that time with them ended on June 30th of 2016. And you will all remember what happened a few months later in 2016, which was the election of Donald Trump to the presidency. And sometime in the next few days, that election was on a Tuesday, so it was probably Wednesday or Thursday of that same week. I had a meeting with a collaborative of Methodist folk that I was working with at the time to organize immigration clinics at local churches throughout Southern California. And I remember at the end of the meeting, I was commenting to one of the attorneys saying that I was so grateful that I was not in the pulpit anymore on this week in particular, because I didn't know what I would say. I didn't know how I would bring good news to the people in the congregation. And as some of you know, or if you don't know, but African-American Christian worship, I mean, it's all about good news. It's a celebration. And so when I had learned that I was being appointed to St. John's, I did a whole lot of research. I already knew some of this, right? I had studied various liberation theologies in my undergrad work and in seminary. But when I learned I was going to be appointed there, I spent some time specifically looking at James Cone and others that have written extensively about Black liberation theology. And then I attended various Black worship services to get a feel for what I was about to be leading. And it didn't matter what was going on or what the community was dealing with. All of these services were a celebration. Dr. Cornel West talks about subversive joy and revolutionary patience in Black Christianity, which is just a phrase that says so much: subversive joy and revolutionary patience. And this is one of the gifts that he believes the Black church has given America, the insistence on subversive joy in the midst of struggle. And so as I was going back to my story, I was telling this immigration attorney back in 2016, I just wasn't feeling it. I was grateful to not be in the pulpit the next Sunday and try to find something to celebrate. And this attorney, who was also a Christian, looked at me, and I could tell he was thinking, "Oh, ye of little faith." But he was too polite to say it. So instead of that, he told me a story about his grandmother. And one of her grandkids played football for one of the big state schools. I don't know if University of Portland or Washington or something, right? But one of the big state schools. And she loved to watch her grandson play football, obviously. But there was one game in particular that she would watch over and over. And her grandson's team had won the game, but it was one of these fabulous games that had like ups and downs, and they were close, and then they would get behind, and then they would catch up, and then so it was an exciting game. But the team won in the end, and she knew this, right? Like, once you've watched a game, you know what's going to happen, right? But she would watch a recording of the game over and over. And so this attorney had asked her, Grandma, why do you watch this over and over? You know how it ends. And she said, that's why I love it so much. I know how it ends. And so this immigration attorney was reminding me that as Christians, one of the things that we know with faith is we know how the story ends. And, we throughout the year, throughout the preaching season, we've got this 3-year cycle. We repeat the scriptures over and find new things in them and preach them. It's a cycle. Every year we tell the same stories. We know how the story ends. Now, I don't come from a part of the Christian tradition that emphasizes life after death, or Jesus coming back. And so that's not really what I mean by like, we know how the story ends. But so I don't really focus on the end of that story. But I do believe in the kingdom of God that is with us now on earth, but it's also not yet. And this is basically what Dr. King called the beloved community. And so I do believe that we are all called to be partners with God in building the beloved community. So yes, I know the end of the story. As Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So yes, it's a long, long story, but I still know the end. So just like this, attorney's grandmother found great joy at watching that football game where she already knew the ending. It was my job as a leader to help my congregation find joy in the ongoing struggle, to celebrate that we all know the end of the story, yes, but also to celebrate that we're in the struggle together. And one of the things I've often wondered is, where does this subversive joy and this, revolutionary patience come from? And I really think it comes from that togetherness. It comes from, and this is not unique to the Christian tradition, obviously, but it comes from that practice of gathering, the practice of, when the people gather, of sharing sharing what's going on, their deepest concerns and their deepest joys, lifting which we do when we lift one another up in prayer, and we share, prayer needs that we have. It comes from when we do that and we embrace one another and pray together, and then we sing songs together. We harmonize together. We lift our voices together, which has a certain resonance and joy in it. So it really is that intimate sharing and togetherness that I believe where that subversive joy and the revolutionary patience comes from. So at this point, I want to invite our next speaker to share, and that will be Akbar Hussaini, who is the executive director at the Newport Mesa Irvine Interfaith Council, and he'll be sharing from a Muslim perspective. So, Akbar. Wait till we unmute you.
Oh.
Sorry.
There you
go. Okay. Thank you, Reverend Jennifer Gutierrez, and thank you everyone for being here. These are indeed tough times for everyone, especially those who are directly affected in places like Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine. We're seeing evil play out in too many places in this world. And may God protect all human beings from evil. One of the first questions that come to our mind is, why does God allow such things to happen? In Islam, we believe that God created good and allowed some of his creation the ultimate responsibility of free will. It is this exercise of free will which takes human beings far from the good and into the evil. Just as darkness is the absence of light, so is evil the absence of God's goodness. In fact, there are many verses in Quran that speak about the Arabic word for light, which is nur, and tells humanity that the closer we get to God, we will be exposed to his light, and the farther we get away from him, we will be lost in the darkness. There's a verse in the Quran that's relevant here, chapter 42, verse 30, which says, whenever misfortune befalls you, or whatever misfortune befalls you, it is a consequence of your own deeds, but much of it God forgives. And I think this above verse is particularly relevant for the couple of situations I mentioned earlier at the beginning. And God also says that in Quran, he says that, and certainly when you're tested with something or tested with either fear, hunger, loss of wealth or loss of lives, it says, in those situations, God gives glad tidings to the ones who are patient. There's a word in Arabic for that called sabirun, with sabr being patience. And the continuation of that verse says, who, when afflicted with calamity, says, truly to God we belong, and truly to him we shall return. Here God reminds us that patience is a virtue, which shall certainly be rewarded. In fact, this last part of the verse is what we as Muslims are advised to recite when we hear of a loss of human life. I don't know if many of you have heard this term called Inna Lillahi wa Inna Ilaihi Raji'un, which means to God we belong, and indeed to him we shall return. And then God also reminds us that if there is good in our heart, we will find something better. So the verse says, if Allah knows, Allah is the word for God in Arabic. It's not a specific Muslim God, but just the general word for God. Al-Ilah is the breakdown of the word Allah. Al-Ilah means the God. So if Allah knows any good in your hearts, he will give you something better than what was taken from you. And he will forgive you. And Allah is the most forgiving and merciful. So God constantly reminds us that we should always expect and pray for mercy from him. Every chapter of Quran starts with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which translates to in the name of Allah, the most compassionate and the most merciful. When I reflected on this, I thought about how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he was starting to preach this message of monotheism in a society that worshipped several deities, and that to believe in an unseen, formless God, that was something very different. It was an unheard of concept at that time. He would get questions like, oh, is your God more powerful than our bird God who can fly from earth to the heavens? And he was being taunted and ridiculed. And, before he started preaching, he was a very well-respected person for his honesty and trustworthiness. He was given the title of Al-Amin, which is the most trustworthy. Now, the same people were ridiculing him, calling him crazy. And it is at this time that God sent an entire chapter. It's a very short chapter. The name of that chapter is Ash-Shahr, which translates to the expansion of heart. That's when your chest feels compressed with the external pressures. When you think that you cannot breathe, then that relief that comes is what's called Ash-Shahr. It's the expansion, so you can take a deep breath. So I'm just going to read the translation of that small chapter. So what God did in that situation is give him the vision of what the future beholds for him and the message that he was preaching. And then he revealed this chapter, which reads, "Have we not lifted your heart from you or for you, O prophet, relieved you of the burden which weighed so heavily on your back, and elevated your reputation for you? So surely with hardship comes ease. Surely with that hardship comes more ease. So once you have fulfilled your duty, strive in devotion, turning to your Lord alone with hope." So what the prophet directly and all of us indirectly are reminded here is, in even the toughest situation, do what you're supposed to do. Do the right thing. And then have trust in God, because God promises that there will be relief. God promises that there will indeed be situations where things will get better. And when they do get better, do not turn away from Him. Submit yourself to Him in your entirety. In Islam, sadness is recognized as an inevitable human condition, which has to be taken seriously. And God shows that there are always ways out of this situation as long as you have hope in God. In fact, the ultimate sin, which is called kufr, is the denial. And that denial is when human being loses hope in his or her God. Allow me to conclude this with a short story. I actually mentioned this story yesterday in an interfaith gathering, and I think it may have some relevance to what we see happening in the world. So imagine a man riding a donkey approaches the gates of a city where the chief of the city stands in full regalia to receive someone important. The chief of the city was expecting the head of state of a new nation, to whom he had agreed to hand over the keys to the city. And the sight of this man in ordinary worn-out clothes, he wondered, is this trickery or a deliberate attempt to insult him? Very soon it became apparent to him that it was neither. The man was indeed the head of state. As they started talking about the terms of surrender, he realized that the humility of his counterpart overshadowed the pomp and circumstance he had prepared for the occasion. Experienced as he was in such negotiations, he expected tough give and take to salvage respect and protect lives in a city. He was surprised again at the voluntary concessions made by the head of state, which exceeded what would have been his initial ask. No lives were to be lost, no property damaged, no places of worship will be burnt down. Instead, full freedom to practice their own religion with all the rituals. Just as he was evaluating whether all this is too good to be true, the head of state wanted to offer prayer. He immediately offered the main temple in the center of the city partly to show off its grandeur. The head of state politely declined, saying that if he prayed in the temple, the followers of his religion may later use it as an excuse to convert it to their own place of worship. If this was a true story that happened today, it will become a remarkable example of interfaith brotherhood. What makes this story even more inspiring is that it happened in 637 AD. And what saddens me the most is that it happened in the same region where bloodshed and destruction is being unleashed these days. Yes, I'm talking about Jerusalem. The chief of the city was Patriarch Sophronius, who would not hand over this holy city to anyone less than the head of state, who was the second caliph or the second successor to Prophet Muhammad, whose name was Omar ibn al-Khattab. And the temple where Omar refused to pray, fearing that it may be converted to a mosque, was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Church of Resurrection of Jesus Christ. One of the first orders by Caliph Omar was to allow Jews who were expelled by the Romans centuries ago back into the city. This is not a utopian story, but a verifiable historical event, which is shocking to the world we live in today. I could not think of a more positive and relevant historical event to recall that will give us all hope. These days, it has become tricky even to talk about this without offending one side or the other. However, in my humble opinion, it should not have to be that complicated. Unless we have discovered a new religion that condones indiscriminate violence and bloodshed, I urge every one of our religious leaders to distance ourselves from the ugliness seen in Israel and Gaza. Do not provide the cover of religion to the murderers. No need to get God involved in this man-made catastrophe. Let us call it for what it is, which is a geopolitical mess created by man, a bloody mayhem that permanently stains humanity. Airwaves are filled with loud voices that estimate the value of human life on different sides as different. The raging debate on moral equivalence obscures the shame with which we should all hang our heads down at the moral and ethical decay on full display. We need a conversation based not on religion or nationality that divides us, but based on humanity that binds us all together. Then maybe, just maybe, we can find a way and the will to take the first steps towards a lasting peace based on justice. That is my plea, and it is also my prayer. Thank you.
Thank you, Akbar. Thank you so much. I do want to remind everybody to please go ahead and submit questions through the Q&A. There's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it right away, look in the more, the little dot that says more underneath it. Look there and you'll see Q&A. And then you can submit questions there for any of our speakers. Next, I want to invite Reverend Gyokei Yokoyama. He's the Buddhist priest at Montebello Sozenji Buddhist Temple and also the secretary of the Soto Zen Buddhism of North America. Gyokei.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's so wonderful to see you and be able to be here, zooming in from East Los Angeles. I'm Gyokei Yokoyama. I'm Japanese. I've been in the US for the last 10 years. While serving declining community, I also serve this office of Soto Zen Buddhism in North America, which keeps sending me to all different parts of North American continent. To put it simply, I'm Zen social worker. I'm decided to call myself that way. Buddhism has, in California, LA especially, has an interesting story. Through the internment camp experience in World War II, the ministers of Japanese American temples started to have built this very strong ties. We talk about something very private, our salary, our pension, what's waiting for us after retirement, nursing home, our families. I myself is a father of a 10-year-old boy with Down syndrome. So we have a bit more like a family sort of ties. And in Zen, we talk about the significance of recognizing what's relative, what seems so mundane, what seems so like everyday stuff, and how that is not separate from the absolute. Especially if we want to talk about absolute, we can't skip the relatives. So that's one perspective that we have in Zen. I decided to share this. I shared this in the recent wedding ceremony that I conducted. To love is to recognize, and to be loved is to be recognized. And that's a word from Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen teacher who came to the US as the Vietnam War took place. I'd like to share a bit of a practice in this sort of a few minutes, if you don't mind, as what we do. Although different schools say different things slightly, we talk about recognition, and then maybe you might have heard the word mindfulness as a secular practice. I have a couple of students who work in hospitals and military base to share this mindfulness as a secular practice. And people use it for mental health, self-care. And yet, so this is something that I thought I would share a little bit. In Buddhism or in Zen, we talk about how love or compassion unfolds in two ways as far as our practice is concerned. One way is our compassion unfolds with our full awareness of our shortcomings, the shortcomings of the world, flaws of the system, everything that challenges us. And most importantly, all the inevitable, the unavoidable. In Buddhism, we say the birth, aging, illness, and death. So with that full awareness and acceptance, and that's one. And the other way that we say it, how it unfolds with all the inevitable and unavoidable as a part of human nature, is that it unfolds as the function of the entirety of compassion itself. So our frustration, our anger, sorrow, is deeply tied to our vows that leads us to our actions. And this interconnectedness of suffering to awakening is something, especially Mahayana school, we talk about. I'd like to kind of guide you in just a few minutes. If you can kind of sit back on a sofa. We ask people to sit up straight, but I know it's probably not a comfortable way to sit. We use abdominal breathing, and that's just the way we do. So we use the word, if you do martial arts, you might have heard of the word hara, tanden, breathe through our stomach instead of overly using the lungs. And it's actual practice. Relaxing the shoulders, relaxing, and yet entrusting our bones, our body structures to sustain our weight against the gravity. Entrusting our body to the earth, and then the earth will support us. Directing our feelings, attention, kindly to our feet, to our knees, your thighs, your whole legs. Allowing yourself to recognize the tensions that's usually hiding. Relax if you're adding any tension on top of what the body is sustaining. Also recognizing that there are pains, discomfort. Rather than trying to push it away, relax this relationship with the pains and discomfort. Your waist and back, your shoulders, your entire arms, and your neck. Extending our attention to what we can sense, recognize. Our eyes, cheek, and nose. Relaxing. Letting the tensions and go, yet allowing the tensions that we need to sustain our weight of our body to be there. Same with our internal organs, what we cannot recognize, yet extending our thought to our heart, lungs, stomach, our muscles, blood, bones, skin, nerves. Same with our feelings, anger, agitation, stress, also excitement, sorrow, hope. If they are there, they are there. Allowing that relationship that we have with these emotions to let go of the tensions, unnecessarily tensions that we add. Same with our intellectual understanding, constructive reality, what we know through the information we have access through media, what we don't know. We are who we are with the ideas that we have. And that's also a causality, allowing them to be exactly who we are, letting the tension go. That sits in the relationship that we have. And that's the awareness. We also have a compassion practice. Suffering, the experience, our emotions, our delusions. Awareness of our delusions all leads to our vows, and these vows lead us to actions, inviting our loved ones to our heart and mind, recognizing their love to you and your love through their love. We extend our thoughts to those who are somewhat distant in our relationship. With subtle, vague awareness, recognizing their pains, the pains of their loved ones. Extending our thoughts to those who are beyond our awareness. With a subtle, vague recognition of their pains of their loved ones. Extending our thoughts to those who are beyond our understanding, our preference, and yet recognizing their pains, the pains of their loved ones. We recognize our own suffering. That is also the suffering of the world. that is how we understand the practice. I'll conclude it. I'll finish it here to honor the time frame. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Gyokei. Thank you. And now we have Yehudah Webster. He's a faculty member at the Inside Out Wisdom and Action, and he'll be sharing with us from a Jewish perspective. Thank you, Yehudah.
Shalom. Good evening. Thank you so much, Reverend, my fellow panelists, for this opportunity to learn and share with one another what sustains us in these very difficult times. And from the outset, I want to give gratitude and blessing to Hashem, the name, Yehovah, the creator in the Jewish tradition, for creating the conditions for us to gather together and connect even in these most challenging times. Again, I'm Yehudah. I'm part of the Inside Out Wisdom and Action Project team, where we equip advocates, organizers, those of us committed to the work of social justice with the Jewish spiritual practices of Musar, that's applied Jewish ethics, to help us be more effective, sustained, and successful in our justice efforts. You know, for us at the Iowa Project, estrangement from interpersonal conflict, estrangement from the engineered othering, estrangement from ourselves, the Most High, and others, is at the root of the cruelty, the dehumanization, the exploitation that gives life to the suffering of oppressive systems like racism, white supremacy, capitalism, just to name a few. And so for us at the Iowa Project, our mission is to replace this estrangement, transform it altogether with connection through the Jewish spiritual practice, the discipline of Musar. The type of connection that will give life to the equity, peace, justice that we're all here fighting for. And I say all this to say that connection, what all of my fellow panelists have uplifted in one way or another, is at the heart of what's needed in this moment to sustain us in these very challenging of times. We need to build the spiritual muscle, the grit, to stay connected even in our most vehement of disagreements. Again, that's connection with the Creator, connection with ourselves, connection with others, and even our opponents, as Akbar uplifted in that story. And when I say opponents, I simply mean those that oppose our efforts of justice. That could be friends, family, colleagues, those that are typically comrades in our work of justice that in this moment may be in opposition. We gotta build that spiritual grit to stay connected, because it's only through that connection that we'll ultimately get to our desired outcome of ending the suffering of our loved ones, ensuring their safety, and creating the conditions for everyone's ability to live whole lives. And I'll just offer from the outset, I named the Creator first, because I know for myself, when I'm feeling disconnected from others or even my own being, that the way back to that connection is through connecting to the Creator through prayer, through Torah study, because it grounds me, it holds me accountable to a set of values that are greater than myself and those that are around me. Of course, this connection that is needed in this time to sustain us is very difficult. There's a lot of very justified emotions of anger, of fear, of grief. that can get in the way of us being able to sustain this connection. In Jewish practice, our feelings are neither good nor bad. We're not trying to push them away or overly rely on them, but we, in the practice of Musar, we're taught to work with these emotions, become masters over what we call our character, our soul traits, the traits of the spirit, for the purpose of being holy, bringing more care, more light into the world through that connection. And in many ways, it's working with our emotions, with these traits of the spirit, that not only helps us stay open to the possibility of connection, but can actually facilitate connection itself. Let's take, for example, anger. Anger is often a forbidden emotion, particularly for those of us that are targeted by oppressive systems. We're told that expressions of anger indicate our danger to society. But I'm here to say that it's important that we recognize that it's a human emotion, indeed a reflection of our quality of being created in the image of on high. So if you're feeling angry in this moment, I'm just here to affirm that anger right now. There's a lot to be angry about. There's a lot of destruction to be upset by. We get to be angry. Even in the Torah, we see moments of divine anger. And the divine brings that anger into a safe space to vent it, right? So that it doesn't become harmful and destructive. But we got to be able to process our anger. And so I invite you to get familiar with your anger. It's a force of protection of ourselves and those that we care for. It needs to be processed, metabolized, so it doesn't just detonate in a moment that's inappropriate, in a moment where someone is not deserving of that anger. So a practice that you can try on is call a friend, vent some of your anger as a way to process, metabolize it, get back to connection. If exercise is your thing, bring your anger into exercise. I know I've never run faster. I love to run. I never run faster than when I brought my anger with me. I want to offer prayer. Bring your anger into prayer. Cry out to the heavens. Use the space of your relationship with on high as a way to move through your anger. And I'll just say that now brings me to the practice of lament, of crying out to the heavens, of grief. Again, a family Akbar brought to us that we got to work with our grief. You know, many of us, you may not even have felt anger in this moment. You may have just come straight to grief, because anger oftentimes is a secondary emotion, right? It's that force of protection that covers over our anger, our fear, right? And if you haven't touched grief yet, I invite you to make your way to it. Don't lose it in the sauce of action. Because again, as Akbar had lifted up, grief is a way back to connection. In some ways, it can be a block, but when we work with our grief, it's actually an expression of hope. We share that in our traditions. When we cry out to the heavens, Rabbi David Jaffe of the Inside Out Wisdom and Action Project teaches that that is an expression of hope, that things can change, that it won't always be this way, that the harm that we're experiencing won't last forever. So we must literally touch the pain, cry out. It's a way to make sure that our hearts don't harden. And particularly in the Jewish practice, I'll just lift up that we do this in community, that we don't just do this alone. Again, so that our pain doesn't harden into hatred. The prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu in Hebrew, says in chapter 58 to lift up your voice like a shofar, like a ram's horn. Cry out. Don't hold back. Let the transgressions of your people be heard. So we got to work with our anger. We got to work with our grief as a way to come back to connection. That peace that sustains us all in this moment. And once we've vented our anger, we've created some space for grief, we might be then ready for the challenge to stay connected, not just with others, but also our opponents. In the practice of Musar, that's called sablanut, oftentimes translated as patience, and something that Akbar and Reverend Gutierrez lifted up as well, right? We like to say forbearance, but it reminded me, Reverend, of that revolutionary patience that you were quoting from Cornel West, right? We get in the mystical tradition of Chassidut, that's applied Jewish mysticism, a teaching that we must be able to cultivate the ability to withstand insult and maintain our flow of goodness. The example that Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who writes this, lifts up is the Creator itself. We're taught that each and every day we insult the Creator with the very life force, the flow of goodness from the Creator. We insult this Creator through living outside of integrity with our values, by harming ourselves and one another. And yet, the Creator doesn't cut off that flow of goodness of which we've insulted the Creator with, but maintains it, withstands the insult, and waits for us to come back, return in good faith, return ready to rebuild that connection. And so the Rabbi Moshe Cordovero challenges us to cultivate this ability as well, to be able to withstand insult and keep our goodness flowing. We got to be able to stay connected even to our opponents. We need them too. And so the practice I want to offer you, a very concrete practice that has helped me often, particularly in this moment. At the beginning of your day, before a challenging meeting, bring to mind the community, the person, your comrade, your family that you're struggling to stay connected with. And for 2 minutes, perhaps after some breathing, like the meditation that we were just led through. Thank you so much for that. Repeat the phrase, I will keep my goodness flowing to you. I will keep my goodness flowing to you. And I've been amazed, continuously am amazed of how that mantra, if you will, can set me up and build my spiritual grit to stay connected even in the moments of vehement disagreement. So in conclusion, my friends, I just want to say that what I'm offering here, what I think the Jewish tradition of Musar has to offer for us is that in difficult times, we must stay connected. To stay connected, we got to work with our emotions. They're valid. I affirm those. We work through them to come back to connection so that we can build that muscle to maintain our flow of goodness. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, Yehudah. Thank you. Thank you all, everyone. Thank you, Akbar. Thank you, Gyokei. Thank you, Yehudah. I really appreciate it. I do have some questions that people have shared in the Q&A that I want to lift up. One, I'm going to do the quickest one first. This is a question for Akbar. Where can we read or learn more about the expansion of the heart?
The chapter that I was referring to is chapter 94 in the Holy Quran. And if you look at the translation, you will see what I had mentioned. And if you need the circumstances, then you have to see what's called the tafsir, which tells you the occasion upon which this chapter was revealed to the prophet.
Thank you. Thank you, Akbar. And then there was a question for everyone. How do we co-create an environment where we learn from each other, even with those people with whom we don't believe we have anything to learn? Do you want to, Gyokei, you want to take that one first?
Sure, I'll just make it brief. We have a word, well, I'll just mention the English translation, not knowing. So the moment we know, then we shut out, because that creates that construct. So not knowing is the place. Sometimes it can look like, so what is it? So, but that's all I can say, just as a brief answer.
Thank you. Yehudah, you want to take that one?
Absolutely. I think just to build off of the practice that I left us just with a moment ago around connecting to the flow of goodness, one of the other practices that we really work with is recognizing the goodness in others and within ourselves. And when we can recognize, we call it good point. And this is a practice coming from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, again, from the more Hasidic tradition. It tips someone's scales from the side of the merit of evil to the side of goodness, not just within our own minds, but the idea is that even somewhat energetically, so that they believe that they can be good. And so when we kind of recognize the good points in somebody, even in moments of conflict, for how could they never have done something good, I think it can allow us to do that thing of staying connected, even in the most of challenging conversations.
Mm-hmm. Akbar, any thoughts to add?
You know, before I share my thoughts on that, I was busy writing something. And to me, that should be the quote of the day spoken by our brother Yehudah. He said, "Do not let our pain harden into hatred." What a beautiful quote. I hope I have your permission to use that, because that is beautiful. And in doing so, I may have forgotten the question. Can you please repeat that?
No worries. The question was, how do we co-create this environment where we learn from each other, even from people who we don't think we have anything to learn?
What we need to do, I think, is get back to the basics. And the basics are, when you strip all these covers that we have of religion, faith, nationality, race, we take that all away, we would understand that we connect with every other human being on this planet as a fellow human being. And when you do that, Islam very clearly states that none of you are better than the other. So I am not above or below learning from someone else. And we should definitely open our hearts and our minds to be able to learn from every one of us. In fact, there is a verse in Quran says, God says, "I have created you all different, so you can learn from each other." That is the goal of diversity. And we just need to put aside these garbs that we have put on, these labels that we have put on, these outward identities that we have put on. And the learning will come. We just need to open our hearts and minds. That's it.
Yeah, I think there's a quote from Mother Teresa. I think she's the one who says, "We've forgotten that we belong to one another," which I think speaks to exactly what you're saying. Speaking of quotes from Yehudah, one of the things that struck me at the beginning of what you were saying, Yehudah, was this need to build the spiritual, muscle of building spiritual grit, I think is what you called it, which I'm guessing is, you named some ways to do that, right? It's just a practice. And so I think that would be my answer to this question, to this same question, is just practice, right? the practice of prayer, of crying out, and maintaining that connection to the Creator, the practice of being with people different from us and listening, right? The practice of connecting, the practice of singing together, the practice of gathering each week and worshiping together. So I think we build that spiritual grit and we build that environment where we can be together by doing it, right? By practicing. Yeah. Let me just check I don't see any additional questions in the chat. And we're right at time. It's 7:59. So congrats to us for finishing on time. I do want to say thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you, Gyokei Yokoyama. Thank you, Yehudah Webster. Thank you, Akbar Hussaini. Thank you to everybody who attended for your questions. And we hope to do this again. This was a great moment for. I'm losing my words right now at the end of the night, but it was a really helpful, sustaining time for me, and I hope it was for you as well. And we'll plan to do this again to practice building our spiritual grit.
Reverend Jennifer, if I can figure out how to do this, I might invite everybody to come off mute, or maybe you can all just take yourselves off mute and say thank you as you leave so that we can hear one another's voices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Gracias.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Good night.
Beautiful. Thank you.
God bless. Many blessings.
Shukran.
Thank you.